Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The flickering candlelight barely illuminated the small hut. Naomi held her breath, listening. A soft rustle came from the window, followed by a whisper, a voice she recognized. Her heart pounded as she gripped the knife beneath her mat. If she had learned anything in the past few months, it was that the past never stayed buried, and tonight it had come for her. Naomi adjusted the basket on her head as she walked along the narrow dirt path leading back to her small hut. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting an orange glow over the vast, open fields stretching endlessly on both sides of the road. A warm breeze rustled through the tall grass, carrying with it the distant chatter of villagers heading home from the market. She had taken longer than expected, haggling over the price of maize and dried fish, and now the shadows were growing longer. The market was always lively, a mix of voices calling out prices, the scent of roasted plantains, and the occasional squabble between traders. But Naomi never lingered longer than necessary. The fewer people who knew her whereabouts, the better. As she walked, her mind drifted to the past, memories she tried to suppress. Her father's laughter echoing through their grand house, the warmth of his embrace. Then the memory would twist, turning dark, shifting to the night she had fled. The sound of his last breath. The blood. Her stepmother's cold, triumphant stare. Naomi shook her head, blinking back the images. That life was gone. She had built something new here, in this quiet village where no one knew her true story. She was almost home when she noticed something unusual. A figure slumped by the side of the road, half hidden in the tall grass. At first, she thought it was just another farmer resting after a long day. But as she stepped closer, she realized something was wrong. The man's clothes were stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, his face contorted in pain. Naomi hesitated, her heart pounding. She had learned to be cautious, to avoid unnecessary risks, but something about him, his fragile state, the unconscious groan that escaped his lips, made her kneel beside him. His skin was warm, feverish. She glanced around. The road was empty. If she left him here, he would likely die before morning. With a deep breath, she set down her basket and reached for him, ignoring the voice in her head warning her that strangers could be dangerous. Naomi sat cross-legged on the mat, her back resting against the rough mud wall of her hut. The dim glow of the lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the small room. The man lay motionless, his chest rising and falling in a slow, uneven rhythm. She had done what she could, cleaned his wounds, cooled his fever, and given him water, but now all she could do was wait. Her eyes traced the contours of his face in the half-light. He was young, likely in his mid-20s, with strong features softened by exhaustion. A thin layer of sweat clung to his skin, his dark brows slightly furrowed, as though caught in a troubled dream. Naomi wondered who he was and what had happened to him. Had he been attacked by thieves? Fallen from a cart? The roads could be dangerous at night, but something about him unsettled her. His clothes, though torn and dirted, hinted at a life of some privilege, not the garments of a common traveler. She sighed, rubbing her hands together to warm them. The night air had grown cool, slipping in through the cracks in the walls. Outside, the distant sounds of insects and rustling leaves filled the silence. It was strange, having someone else in her home. For months, she had lived alone, speaking only in brief exchanges at the market, keeping her distance from the villagers. It was safer that way. Yet here she was, sharing her space with a stranger. A sharp inhale from the man drew her attention. His fingers twitched against the woven mat, his head tilting slightly to the side. Naomi straightened, watching as his eyelids fluttered, his body shifting as though struggling to wake. He groaned softly, his breathing uneven. Then, after what felt like an eternity, his eyes opened. At first, they were unfocused, staring at the thatched roof above him. Then, slowly, his gaze drifted toward her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Naomi could see the confusion in his face, the way his brows pulled together, his lips parting slightly as though searching for words. His hand moved weakly toward his side, fingers brushing against the bandage she had wrapped around his ribs. He winced. "You shouldn't move too much," Naomi said, her voice steady but quiet. The man turned his head toward her, studying her in silence. His breathing was still labored, but his eyes, dark and sharp, were alert now, searching her face as though trying to place her. "Where?" His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "You're in my home," Naomi answered simply. "I found you by the roadside. You were injured." His lips pressed together, his expression unreadable. He blinked slowly, then let his head rest back against the mat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Naomi wasn't sure if he was too weak to continue or simply unwilling to. She watched as he exhaled heavily, his chest rising and falling with the effort. After a while, she reached for the small wooden bowl beside her, filled with water. "Drink," she said, holding it out to him. He hesitated before lifting his arm, his movements slow and weak. When his fingers finally wrapped around the bowl, they brushed against hers, rough and calloused. He brought it to his lips, taking small sips before lowering it again. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice still raspy. Naomi nodded but said nothing. She wasn't sure what to make of him yet. She turned away, adjusting the lantern's wick to keep the flame steady. Shadows danced along the walls as she moved, her thoughts clouded with unease. "What's your name?" she asked finally. The man hesitated. His lips parted as if to answer, but then he hesitated again, his gaze flickering away. It was only for a second, but Naomi noticed. She frowned. "I can fight in a fires nippertvibe kennen. Fratse fires as shoviers, wurtzels offensive pranks. On time at to brave ten bursage, duret series, courtful in the tart or presence, to thu the flea surf. And cheer her giftuis, and sore sorting tea pave or fried to praces or to soul met smurfer course scram." "Daniel," he said at last. Naomi studied him. Something about the way he had answered made her uneasy, as if the name didn't quite belong to him. But she kept her thoughts to herself. "I'm Naomi," she said simply. Daniel gave a small nod, but said nothing more. She stood, brushing the dust from her wrapper. "You should rest," she told him. "You lost a lot of blood." Daniel didn't protest. His body was clearly too weak for conversation, and within moments, his eyelids drooped once more. Naomi watched him for a while, then turned toward the wooden shelf where she kept her few belongings. She reached for a worn piece of cloth, draping it over herself as she sat back down. Sleep didn't come easily. Beschleifslis carning pambijing. But vises was slush the mind that come, ben of brain and is it. Sleep didn't come easily. Sleep is carned in the pine benzilla slice. To the dead him dim dawn, let sillish easily slays pambizily. For the slightest man of slush pump soul. Filth didn't come easily. Even as the night stretched on, Naomi found herself listening to the sound of Daniel's breathing, slow and steady in the quiet. There was something about him that didn't sit right with her, something she couldn't quite name. But for now, she had no choice but to wait. The rooster's distant crow signaled the first hint of dawn, but Naomi had already been awake for hours. Sleep had been shallow and restless, her mind unsettled by the presence of the stranger lying just a few feet away. She sat on the edge of her woven mat, watching as the early morning light seeped through the small cracks in the walls of her hut, casting thin golden streaks across the packed dirt floor. Daniel was still asleep. His breathing had steadied overnight, no longer labored with fever, but his body remained motionless, except for the faint rise and fall of his chest. Naomi's gaze lingered on him. Now that the harsh glow of the lantern had been replaced by soft daylight, she could see him more clearly. His skin was lightly marred with healing scars, the kind that didn't come from a single accident, but rather from years of hardship. His jawline was strong, his face almost peaceful in sleep, but Naomi had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. She rose silently, tying her wrapper tighter around her waist before stepping outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint smokiness of early cooking fires from neighboring huts. A few women were already up, sweeping the ground in front of their homes, exchanging quiet greetings as they began their daily routines. Naomi kept her head down, moving toward the clay water pot near the side of her hut. She poured the cool liquid into a small wooden bowl and drank slowly, letting the water wash away the dryness from her throat. A part of her wondered why she felt so tense. She had taken in a wounded man, nothing more. Yet her instincts warned her not to be too trusting. Naomi stirred the pot of porridge slowly, watching as the thick mixture bubbled over the low fire. The warmth of the flames barely reached her, the early morning air still clinging to a crisp chill. Her hut was quiet except for the soft crackling of the burning wood and the occasional distant chatter from the village waking up. But her mind was restless. Behind her, Daniel shifted slightly on the mat. He had woken briefly earlier, just long enough to take a few sips of water and eat the small portion of food she had given him. He had spoken little, his words clipped and measured, as if each one had to be carefully chosen. Naomi had not pressed him. Instead, she had watched him, studied the way his eyes darted around the hut as though mapping every corner, every possible exit. Now, as the porridge thickened, she found herself glancing in his direction again. He was still lying down, but his posture had changed. His breathing, though slow, was more controlled. He was awake. "You don't sleep deeply," she said, not turning around. There was a pause before his voice came, hoarse but steady. "Habit." Naomi poured the porridge into a wooden bowl and carried it over to him. She handed it to him wordlessly, watching as he hesitated for just a second before taking it. His fingers wrapped around the bowl, and he sat up slowly, wincing as he moved. She sat across from him, her legs tucked beneath her, studying him as he took small bites. There was something deliberate about the way he ate, not the desperate hunger of someone who had been starving for days, but the careful restraint of a man who had learned never to appear too vulnerable. "Do you remember what happened to you?" she asked finally. Daniel's gaze flickered up to hers before he looked down again. "Not much," he said, his voice neutral. "I remember walking. Then pain." He took another bite. "Then I woke up here." It was a vague answer. Too vague. Naomi didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch between them. Outside, a child's laughter echoed briefly before fading into the sounds of the morning. "You don't seem surprised to be here," she observed. But Daniel shrugged. "Waking up in strange places isn't new to me." Naomi frowned slightly. He was careful with his words, but she was good at noticing what people left unsaid. He had the air of someone who had seen too much, someone who had learned not to offer information freely. She leaned back against the wall. "You don't talk much." "I don't have much to say." A small smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. "Liar." Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her. His dark eyes studied her face as if trying to read her intentions. Naomi held his gaze, unflinching. A beat passed. Then, to her surprise, he let out a quiet breath, something that might have been a ghost of a chuckle.
"You ask too many questions," he said.
Naomi tilted her head.
"And you answer too few."
Another brief silence, but this time it felt different, less guarded. Daniel set the bowl down beside him and exhaled slowly. He shifted, testing his injured side before leaning back slightly. "I should leave soon," he said.
Naomi raised an eyebrow. "You can barely sit up without wincing." "I'll manage."
She studied him for a moment. He was determined. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his hands curled slightly as if ready to push himself to his feet at any moment. But beneath that determination, there was something else. Something uncertain.
"You're running from something," she said. "It wasn't a question."
Daniel's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "I should leave soon," he repeated instead. Naomi didn't push further. Instead, she stood, brushing dust from her wrapper. "Rest first," she said simply. "The road isn't kind to men who think they're stronger than they are." He didn't argue this time. She turned away, stepping outside into the sunlight, but her thoughts lingered on the stranger in her home. She had a feeling that whatever Daniel was running from, it was much closer than he realized. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting golden light over the village. Naomi moved through the narrow paths between huts, basket in hand, her mind unsettled. The air smelled of roasting maize and fresh earth, but she barely noticed. She had left Daniel behind, resting on the woven mat in her hut, though she knew he was not truly resting. Even injured, he was too alert, too aware of his surroundings. He was a man used to danger, and he was hiding something. Naomi adjusted the basket on her hip, her feet moving automatically toward the market. The chatter of villagers rose around her, women bargaining for yams, children darting between stalls, the occasional clatter of metal as a blacksmith worked in the distance. She nodded in greeting to a few familiar faces, but did not stop to talk. Her thoughts were still back in her hut.
"Daniel."
"Halsa Daniel,
Hadwadan en bedjuret bordig, forward, divandimus, alles at ariad. For jedingne, warder salva maimet, witting guenido. What the porter drew Daniel, the date you are good taves, whereadar, and word benedicta henon. Word der brarte deen that an molen. Wolo war had done a kid. Or the little word and you read it. There was something about him she couldn't ignore. The way he had hesitated before saying his name. The careful way he spoke, revealing little but watching everything. She knew the signs. She had learned long ago how to recognize a man guarding a secret. As she reached a stall selling dried fish, she forced herself to focus. She selected a few pieces, placing them carefully into her basket. The old woman behind the stall gave her a curious look. "You don't usually buy much," the woman noted. "Expecting visitors?" Naomi hesitated, then shook her head. "Just stocking up." The woman hummed in response, but Naomi could feel her gaze lingering. The village was small. People noticed things. She quickly paid and moved on, weaving through the market until she had gathered what she needed. Then, basket full, she turned toward home. The walk back was slow. The weight of her thoughts matched the weight in her arms. When she pushed open the wooden door of her hut, she found Daniel sitting up, his back resting against the wall. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "You went to the market," he said. "Soulless lamb. You went to the market," he said. "You went to the market," he said. "You went to the market," he said. "Solslosel lefrosle cami. Chipesa tuterfensiget sarkit," he said. "But it is a less loveless. There is purposeless in the fortunate, she said, by life was of force license a tough to the target. He said, less of luck. He said,
Naomi set the basket down. We need to eat. He nodded but said nothing more. She busied herself with unpacking, setting the food aside before pouring him a bowl of water. She handed it to him, watching as he took it with a small nod of thanks. For a while neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint sounds of the village outside. Then, finally, Naomi asked, "Who are you really?" Daniel stilled. The bowl remained in his hands, his fingers tightening around its edges. "I told you," he said. Naomi met his gaze. "You told me a name. Names don't mean much." His jaw tensed. For the first time since she had found him, he looked uneasy. She leaned against the wall, crossing her arms. "You hesitated when I asked your name. You watch everything like you're waiting for something to happen. And you want to leave before you've even healed." Daniel's eyes darkened slightly, but he didn't respond. Naomi exhaled. "I don't know who you are, or what you're hiding. But if trouble follows you here, it becomes my trouble too." A long pause. After a long pause. A requisite van fret bets the rees, or fortuitous gravely said. A long pause. Advancing back is a list of our voice, unbedulous curves, on which activities to force. A long pause, and long pause. Then, slowly, Daniel set the bowl down beside him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "You shouldn't have helped me." Naomi frowned. "I didn't have a choice." Daniel's gaze met hers, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Neither did I," he murmured. The word sent a shiver through her, though she didn't understand why. For the first time, Naomi wondered if bringing him into her home had been a mistake. The sun hung lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the village as Naomi stepped outside her hut. The air was thick with the scent of evening fires, smoke curling from chimneys as women prepared supper. Children's laughter rang through the air, but to Naomi, everything felt distant, muted, like she was walking through a dream. Her conversation with Daniel had left her uneasy. He had not denied hiding something. Instead, he had given her just enough to confirm her suspicions without answering any real questions. "You shouldn't have helped me." His words clung to her like damp cloth, heavy and impossible to ignore. She tightened her wrapper around her waist, exhaling slowly. There was only one thing she was sure of: Daniel was dangerous. And yet he was still in her home. She turned back toward the hut. He had barely moved since their talk, still seated against the wall, his body tense despite the exhaustion that lined his face. His eyes flickered toward her as she entered, watching her movements carefully. Naomi ignored the weight of his stare as she set about preparing the evening meal. She worked slowly, her hands steady as she sliced vegetables and added them to the simmering pot. The silence between them stretched. Then, finally, Daniel spoke. "You live alone." It wasn't a question. And tog Brooklyn pist breastes, wortels, britchetes it bis olves bangs. Vilente tolsels, britches the sabbathustin basistes borchen to worchen to postin. In it blesses breschen the back and as a breschen. To die bridges is a question. Of Dockland so was mice. Naomi stirred the pot, her grip tightening around the wooden spoon. "Yes." He didn't respond immediately. She could feel him studying her, though she refused to meet his gaze. "That's not common," he said eventually. Naomi let out a quiet breath. No, it's not. Another pause. Another pause. Under vekkan soprat pinaveri brapus, bikinius alasan, or frida was. Another pause. Wortibespons, or the beckon touchhold. Atopa, fullus, and data coppa. To savor zevichekas of races, or texel sorter. Also the selfie choose, but must suffice. Then, softer this time, why? She stopped stirring. Halsbestoving stabler lasna per enis, fashioned colcotones. She stopped stirring. She stopped her triches. She read to avoid ting. Torthig starts about 4 cheeses, which schluffle, fashion pie the rested of hoys. Koning bischlachis, wort until some gloss. Toward the first of 3 stop above. Fritcha stopped stirring, is full of thoughtful. For a moment, she considered lying, giving him the same answer she gave the villagers when they asked something about preferring solitude, about wanting independence. But something about the way he had asked made her hesitate. Slowly, she turned to face him. Because I had no choice. A flicker of something passed across his face, understanding perhaps. Naomi glanced toward the door, as if checking to make sure no one was listening, though she knew they were alone. Then quietly she said, I left my home a year ago. Daniel didn't speak, but she could feel his attention sharpen. My father was murdered, she continued. The words came out steady, but inside her heart pounded. And I saw who did it. The room felt impossibly small. Daniel's expression didn't change, but there was a shift in the air. Naomi swallowed. My stepmother. For the first time since she had found him, Daniel looked genuinely surprised. She killed him, Naomi whispered, and I ran. The fire crackled, filling the silence between them. Daniel leaned forward slightly. And she let you go? Naomi's breath hitched. No, she admitted. She sent men after me. But I disappeared before they could find me. The words hung between them, heavy and unspoken truths woven between them like thread. Naomi expected Daniel to ask more questions, to press her for details, to demand an explanation. But he didn't. Instead, he simply sat back against the wall, his expression unreadable. And then quietly he said, I know. Naomi froze. Naomi froze. Naomi froze. Naomi bibelize, with diffidence. From the overshire. You will only froze. O gaby frankstimstad. Hobbies dive was world's walls, and lays, a forgive to the keyring. For if the shed is a conversion to its being of you. Sure see beside his stomachs, or fallen a champions, or robust. Her blood turned to ice. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Daniel's gaze met hers, steady and unflinching. And then, softly, almost regretfully, he said, I was sent to kill you. The room closed in around Naomi. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her fingers tightening at her sides. Daniel's words hung between them, heavy and suffocating. I was sent to kill you. Naomi's heart pounded against her ribs, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to reach for something, anything, to defend herself. And yet she didn't move. She just stood there, her body rigid, eyes locked onto Daniel, as if trying to decipher whether he had already decided to finish what he was sent to do. Daniel, for his part, did not move either. He sat against the wall, his posture tense, but his expression was not one of a man preparing to strike. There was no malice in his gaze, no triumphant smirk that came with the confession of power. Instead, there was something else. Something strange.
Guilt en face red back trails, backsprechen everett, bijna meg seis, jullie willen zijn juppen, rug you race, directional leaves tompe, coming in into a time pod. Would it best ported be to make bills data direct, guide red to lace, delays and a kill a list to put that all. Of work would be the Zedovitz mechanics, better.
Naomi swallowed, forcing her voice to remain steady. You knew who I was, she said quietly, this whole time. Daniel exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. Yes. Her nails dug into her palms. And you still stayed? He didn't answer immediately. His fingers tapped idly against the mat beneath him, as though searching for the right words. I didn't plan for this. His voice was low, almost reluctant. I wasn't supposed to get injured. I was supposed to be quick. Naomi's stomach twisted. I stood in per time, per lives. Onevnos at horn, the mains. Benches my toes, and men hurricane. Featured when Naomi's stomach twisted. Timon's stomach twisted, and ben my bones, was benas ben busy tendon. Whisper Neo was biters bellas wolfless. Toes kimex twisted, hearts twisted, and ben in the mummies stomachs wrist. I didn't know what you looked like before I came, Daniel continued. I only knew your name. I only knew that I had to find you. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. But then you saved me. His voice dropped even lower, and nothing made sense anymore. Naomi's mind reeled. Every moment they had shared in the past days, every word, every glance, had been tainted by this truth. He had been sent to kill her. He had sat in her home, eaten her food, slept under her roof, all while knowing she was the target. And yet, she was still alive. She took a slow, cautious step back toward the wooden cooking spoon that rested near the fire. It wasn't the weapon, but it was something. Daniel must have noticed the movement because he sighed. If I wanted to hurt you, Naomi, I would have done it already. A chill ran down her spine at the sound of her name on his lips. She clenched her jaw. And what stopped you? Daniel looked up then, and for the first time, she saw the full weight of his conflict etched into his face. You did. A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. I thought I was doing the right thing, he admitted after a long pause. I've done things before. Things I don't like to think about. He looked down at his hands, as if seeing the ghosts of past sins on his palms. But when you pulled me out of that dirt road, when you fed me instead of leaving me to die, his throat bobbed as he swallowed. Naomi's hands trembled. And that changes things? Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. It changed everything. Her mind struggled to process it all. She had taken in a stranger, nursed him back to health, let her guard down, and the whole time he had been carrying her death sentence. Her body itched to move, to run, to do something, but something in Daniel's eyes kept her rooted. Who sent you? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Daniel's jaw tightened. Your stepmother. Naomi inhaled sharply. A part of her had still been hoping, still been grasping at the idea that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong, that maybe her past wasn't still chasing her. The room felt colder now, the warmth of the fire barely reaching Naomi's skin. Daniel's confession sat between them like an open wound, raw and exposed. She could hear the distant hum of the village outside, life continuing as if nothing had changed. But inside this hut, everything was different. Naomi's fingers twitched at her sides, her mind screaming at her to act, to run, to fight, to scream. But she did none of those things. Instead, she forced herself to breathe, to stay in control. Daniel hadn't moved since his confession. He remained seated, his back against the wall, watching her with an unreadable expression. His body was still tense, as if bracing for the moment she might lash out.
"You expect me to believe you just changed your mind?" Her voice came out colder than she intended. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I don't expect you to believe anything." Naomi clenched her jaw. "Then why tell me?"
He hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. "Because I owe you that much." She let out a bitter laugh. "You owe me nothing, Daniel." Her voice hardened. "I saved your life, and now I find out you were sent here to end mine." She shook her head. "You shouldn't have told me at all."
Daniel's gaze darkened. "You would have figured it out."
The certainty in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. He wasn't wrong. She had felt it, even before his confession, the way he hesitated, the way his words always seemed measured. She had known something was off, but she hadn't wanted to see it.
She took a slow step back, needing distance. "How were you supposed to do it?"
Daniel's jaw tightened. "Does it matter?"
"Yes." Her voice was sharp now, cutting through the thick silence. A muscle in his cheek twitched. Then, finally, he answered. "Poison."
Naomi inhaled sharply.
"She said it had to look like an illness," he continued. "Something quiet. Something no one would question." His voice lowered. She didn't want anyone asking too many questions.
Naomi swallowed hard, forcing down the nausea that threatened to rise. She could picture it too easily. The villagers finding her lifeless body, shaking their heads in quiet sorrow, never suspecting the truth. Her stepmother would have won, taking everything Naomi's father had left behind.
Her hands curled into fists. "And you were going to do it." Daniel didn't flinch at the accusation. Instead, he held her gaze steadily. "I was."
Her chest ached with the weight of betrayal.
"But I didn't." His voice was quieter now, almost pleading. "Naomi, I had a choice, and I made it." She let out a shaky breath. "And now what? You think that makes you my ally?" Daniel was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he said, "I think we want the same thing."
Naomi's eyes narrowed. "And what is that?"
"To stop her."
A cold, bitter laugh escaped Naomi's lips. "You want to stop the same woman who paid you to kill me?" She shook her head. "You expect me to trust that?"
Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "I expect you to listen."
Naomi's heart pounded as she stared at him.
Everything in her screamed that she should throw him out, that she should never believe a word from the lips of a man who had come to kill her. And yet, she hesitated.
Because the truth was, he wasn't wrong. Her stepmother wouldn't stop. Naomi had seen what she was capable of, had watched her slit a man's throat and take everything he had built. She had run from it once, but running hadn't saved her. It had only delayed the inevitable. Her stepmother wanted her dead. That hadn't changed. But maybe, just maybe, Daniel had.
Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. "If you betray me, I will kill you myself." For the first time, something like amusement flickered in Daniel's eyes. "Fair enough."
And just like that, an uneasy alliance was born. The night air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and burning firewood. Naomi sat on the floor of her hut, her back pressed against the cool clay wall, her mind restless. The flickering flames from the oil lamp cast dancing shadows along the walls, stretching and twisting like spirits caught between worlds. Daniel sat across from her, his posture relaxed, but Naomi wasn't fooled. Beneath the stillness, he was calculating, always watching, always thinking. Since their uneasy truce, neither had spoken much. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sting. Naomi still wasn't sure she trusted him. Maybe she never would. But the truth was undeniable. He knew things she didn't, and she needed to know them.
She inhaled deeply. Tell me everything. Daniel's eyes met hers, dark and unreadable. Where do you want me to start?
She hesitated. There was too much to ask, too much to unravel. But one question burned brighter than the rest. How long has she been looking for me? His expression darkened. Since the day you disappeared. Naomi's stomach twisted, though she had suspected as much. And the others? The men before you?
They searched, Daniel admitted. Some got close, but none found you.
She shivered. The idea that she had been hunted all this time, living in the illusion of safety, made her skin crawl. And you? How did you find me?
Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand over his jaw. She has people everywhere. People who listen. A merchant traveling through this village overheard someone mention a woman living alone. Someone who kept to herself, didn't talk much about her past. He paused. It wasn't much, but it was enough.
Naomi looked away, her fists tightening. She had been careful. She had avoided questions, never shared too much. And yet it hadn't been enough.
She wants me dead, she murmured, more to herself than to him. Yes, Daniel's voice was calm, matter of fact. She won't stop until she's certain you're gone.
A bitter laugh escaped Naomi's lips. And what does she think now? That you've done it?
Daniel shook his head. Not yet. She's waiting for confirmation. A message.
Naomi frowned. And if she doesn't get one?
She'll send someone else.
The words were like ice against her skin. Naomi took a slow breath, forcing herself to think. Then we give her one.
Daniel raised an eyebrow. What are you suggesting?
She met his gaze, her voice steady. We let her think I'm dead.
Daniel studied her for a long moment. And then?
Naomi's pulse thrummed in her ears. And then we make sure she never gets the chance to try again.
Silence filled the hut. Daniel's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. You want revenge. Naomi's throat tightened. I want justice.
A flicker of something crossed his expression, approval maybe, or understanding. And you're willing to do what it takes?
Naomi's jaw clenched. I won't let her win. For the first time, Daniel nodded. Then we need a plan. And just like that, the tide shifted.
Naomi had spent so long running, so long hiding in the shadows of fear. But tonight, for the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was fighting back. The night was thick with silence, the kind that felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. Naomi's heart pounded steadily as she adjusted the hood over her head, her fingers trembling slightly despite her determination. Beside her, Daniel crouched low in the undergrowth, his gaze locked onto the grand compound that loomed ahead. The moonlight cast eerie shadows over the high walls, making the place look even more foreboding than she remembered. She hadn't stepped foot here since the night she fled. The memories rushed back like a tide. Her father's lifeless body, the cold glint in her stepmother's eyes, the sheer terror that had driven her into the unknown. But now, she was no longer the frightened girl who had run for her life. She was here to reclaim what was hers. Daniel leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you sure about this? Naomi swallowed hard. There's no turning back. He nodded once, then motioned for her to follow. They moved quickly, their feet barely making a sound against the dirt path leading to the servants' entrance. Daniel had studied the layout of the house through the information he'd gathered before his mission. He knew which guards were on duty, where they would be stationed, and most importantly, how to get in unnoticed. As they crept toward the entrance, Naomi's pulse quickened. The door was slightly ajar, just as Daniel had predicted. They slipped inside, immediately engulfed by the familiar scent of burning wood and oil lamps. Naomi's skin prickled as they moved through the dimly lit corridor, the echo of distant footsteps making her nerves tighten.
"Stay close," Daniel murmured.
She didn't need to be told twice. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound like a warning. But she forced herself to stay steady. They had planned for this moment. There was no room for hesitation.
As they approached the grand hall, Naomi's breath caught. The space was just as she remembered: ornate tapestries, polished floors, the heavy scent of perfume lingering in the air. And at the center of it all, sitting on a cushioned chair, was the woman she had come to face. Her stepmother.
Clara looked almost regal in her silk robes, her long fingers tapping idly against the armrest as she sipped from a jeweled cup. She had always carried herself like royalty, even when she was nothing more than an intruder in Naomi's home. Naomi felt the rage simmering beneath her skin.
Clara sighed, swirling the wine in her cup. "I was beginning to wonder when I'd hear from you," she mused, not bothering to turn around.
Naomi stiffened. How did she know?
Daniel tensed beside her, his hand instinctively reaching for the small dagger at his waist.
Clara let out a quiet chuckle. You didn't think I'd trust just anyone, did you? She finally turned her head slightly, her lips curving into a knowing smile. You were always predictable, Naomi.
Naomi clenched her fists.
Then you should have known I wouldn't stay gone forever.
Clara sighed, setting her cup down with a soft clink. I had hoped you would.
Naomi took a step forward, her voice sharp. You killed my father.
Clara tilted her head slightly. Yes, she admitted without hesitation.
The calmness of her voice sent a chill down Naomi's spine.
Clara stood gracefully, smoothing the fabric of her robe. He was weak, she said, as if discussing an inconvenience. He didn't deserve what he had. He didn't know how to use his power. She took a slow step toward Naomi, her expression unreadable. But I do. Naomi's hands shook, but not with fear, with fury. Jury. You won't get away with it, she said through gritted teeth. Clara arched a brow. And who's going to stop me? You? Her gaze flickered to Daniel. Or the man I hired to kill you? Daniel stiffened, his grip tightening on his dagger. I made my choice. Clara smiled, slow and knowing. Did you? The tension in the air thickened. Naomi didn't wait for another word. She lunged. Clara's eyes widened in surprise as Naomi grabbed the edge of the table and shoved it forward, sending the jeweled cup crashing to the floor. Clara barely managed to step back in time, her poise momentarily slipping. Guards, Clara started, but Daniel moved faster. He grabbed her from behind, pressing the dagger to her throat.
The moment was fleeting but powerful. The woman who had stolen everything from Naomi was now powerless in her grasp.
Clara let out a low, humorless laugh. Do it then.
Naomi's breath came in shallow bursts. She wanted to. Every fiber of her being screamed for revenge. But then she remembered her father, not the way he had died, but the way he had lived. He had been a just man, a fair man. Killing Clara would be too easy. Naomi stepped back, her voice steady. No, I want you to lose everything. Daniel pulled back the dagger just as the guards burst in, but it was too late. Naomi had planned for this. The village elders had been informed. Witnesses had been gathered. Clara's crimes were no longer secrets. The guards hesitated, glancing at each other as the realization sank in. Clara had no more power to wield. You poisoned him, Naomi said, her voice echoing in the hall. And now you'll pay for it. Clara's expression faltered for the first time. You don't know what you're doing. Naomi held her gaze. Yes, I do. And with that, the guard stepped forward, seizing Clara's arms. She struggled, but it was useless. Her reign was over. As she was dragged away, she let out a sharp, furious scream, her composure finally shattering. This isn't over. But Naomi knew better. She turned to Daniel, her chest heaving. It's done. He nodded slowly, slipping the dagger back into its sheath. It is. For the first time in a long time, Naomi felt the weight on her shoulders lift. She had spent so long running, so long hiding. But now, she was free. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.